So let's start setting up our QuartFeed application. To start, we can clone the Quart PostgreSQL boilerplate code that we built in the previous lesson. You can grab the latest version from my GitHub repo here. If you still have the code in your computer like I do, you can just make a copy of it. Make sure to rename the folder to something like QuartFeed app. If you have cache files lying around after the copy, make sure to delete those folders. We begin by installing the requirements. Edit by Project Toml and change the name of the application to QuartFeed app. Save the file. Next, we install the Poetry packages by doing Poetry install. For local development, I will leave the .quartenv as is, since they have generic names that we can use for any Quart application. Now let's go ahead and rename the counter directory to user, since that will be the first module we will be working on. Next, open the models.py file inside the new user folder. Modify the file as follows. First, rename the table to user table and change the table name, which is the first table property, to user. The metadata property will still come from the DB module, so leave that. The first column ID will remain the same. We still want that primary key in the table. The second column we'll call username. This is the first time we'll use the string SQL Alchemy type, so let's add that to the import list on line 1. We'll define the length as 15, and then set the index property to true, since we want to be able to search for users quickly using the username as a query. And finally, we'll say that this column should be unique, since no two users should have the same username. The next column is password, which is also a string with a length of 128, which coincides with the hashing algorithm we're going to use, which always generates a hash of 128 characters. Save the file. Next, let's change the user views py file. On line 3, let's update the import to add the user table. Update line 5 to rename counter app to user app. We actually don't need any of these view functions, so we'll go ahead and delete it. On line 8, update the route to use the user app, and on line 9, we'll rename the function to register, and we'll call this on the /register endpoint. Finally, we'll have this function just return the string user registration, just to make sure everything is working correctly. Save the file. Let's go ahead and update the application py. On line 16 and 19, update the counter app to say user app. Save the file. At this point, I want to make sure the application is running by doing poetry run Quart run. And if I now go to localhost 5000 on the register endpoint, we can see that the application responds with the user registration string. So all the routing seems to be working correctly. If you're using VS Code, we can also use the run button on the editor, since we have the launcher files in our repository. And the nice thing with this approach is that we can set breakpoints and debug our application. So let's start working on our migrations. The first thing we're going to do is to go to the migrations folder and remove all files and directories from the versions folder, since they are all related to the counter app. There's no need to change anything on the Alembic INI, since we're using the same connection method. Next, we'll take a look at the env.py on the migrations folder, and all we need to do here is to update the user model on line 27, like so. Also, please remember, if we add any new models, we need to add it here so that the migration script can detect any new schemas. Save the file. So before we run the migration, we need to set up our Docker environment. So open the Docker file and change the references from counter app to QuartFeed app in line 20 and 23. Save the file, and next we'll update the Docker Compose YAML with a similar change from counter app to QuartFeed app. Save the file. If you still have the containers and the images from the counter app, go ahead and delete them, both the web app and the database app. You can use the Docker desktop application or the VS Code plugin. So go ahead and run docker compose up -- build, and that will build our new application and PostgreSQL containers. After it finishes building, exit using Ctrl+C, and then run just the database container so that we can execute our migration. So we do poetry run alembic revision -- autogenerate -m create user table. This will use the model's metadata and create a new versions file, so keep an eye out on that folder. Perfect. So now we check the new versions file. As we can see, the file has an upgrade section where the user table is created with the ID, username, and password columns, as well as creating an index on username. The downgrade function drops the username index and then drops the user database. The next step is to apply the changes on the database using poetry run alembic upgrade head. Great! So that applied the changes in the database and should have created the user table on our PostgreSQL container. Let's go ahead and check that out. To connect to the database, run the following command in a new shell. So now we're in PostgreSQL. We can see the databases by doing \l, and as you can see, there's an app database owned by the user app user. We can connect to the app database by doing \c app. And if we list the tables there by using \dt, we'll see that we have the Alembic version table and the user table created. We can check the contents of the Alembic version table by doing select * from Alembic version. As you can see, the version num field coincides with the revision ID on the versions file. We can also check the schema for the user table by doing \d user. We have the ID, which has an xfile function, meaning it automatically increments by 1 with each record, the username and password with the right lengths, and the two indexes, one for the ID and the other for the username. Everything looks good, so we're ready to start working on the user registration component of our Quart application.